Hello, Sensemakers, and welcome to Making Sense of Ourselves, a podcast about the hard work it takes to figure out who you are and what you want in this world. I'm Abby Covert, and with me is my co-host, Alfi Alo. In our first episode, we talk through a very high-level introduction of ourselves as hosts and instructors on the journey of making sense of ourselves, and we touched on how we met and a surface-level review of the program. Moving forward, we want to focus each episode on an individual idea or a deeper dive on a concept and how it relates to making sense of ourselves. The first idea that we're going to be exploring is the initial idea that brought Alfie and I together, the Zone of Proximal Development. So in this episode, we're going to talk about what the Zone of Proximal Development is, why it became such a central theme in our work together, and we're going to share 3 signs with you that you're currently working within your Zone of Proximal Development. So to get us started, Alfie, can you tell us what exactly is the Zone of Proximal Development?
Thanks, Abby, and how's it going, everyone? I think it's crazy, and I think it's also a good place for us to kind of start in terms of the subject matters that we're going into a little bit of depth on, just because in some ways it's also a really foundational idea to the work we were doing together. But I think for us to get a good understanding of it, I thought it might be good to get a sense of where the idea originated, but not necessarily from a historical perspective, more from the perspective of the questions that were asked that eventually led to this idea. And so there's a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, and he was extremely interested in early childhood development, but more specifically like the process of learning and the details of it. And so there were essentially like 3 questions that sort of summed up the majority of his contribution to the field of psychology, because unfortunately he passed away at around 33, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But so the first question was like, if you look at education or the way that people learn, maybe education is a little bit further down the line, but if you look at the way people learn, it's clear that we've figured out that it's more useful when there is an adult or there is a more older or experienced person in the mix. And so like getting to understand why that is was one of the first central questions that kind of guided Vygotsky's career, because he noticed that with some people, having somebody to help and having somebody to guide would have an outsized effect on their growth or their development. And so that observation eventually actually led him to sort of wonder about like how exactly it is that a person who knows more helps. Because I mean, they're like, if you watch a teacher helping a child, it's not like they just give you the answer or like they write something down, you read it and suddenly you understand. And so he wanted to get deeper into understanding what the actual mechanism of support or help is from a teacher that enables you to learn more. Mm-hmm. And I think that aspect led him to another idea, which is somewhat parallel to the Zone of Proximal Development, but also related, is whether or not there's a specific time. If you think about a person's process of learning from like the very first time you try something to when you're starting to get it right to when you've really mastered the skill, like, is there an ideal point at which a teacher should intervene? Or does it not really matter and they kind of just sort of help you whenever you ask for help or whenever you think you need help? And so in his work, he was really grappling with these questions, and a lot of his experimentation and learning was done, though he was learning about learning in general, was done in the context of learning of young children. And so if we take those questions about, why is it important to have somebody who's more experienced? At what point should that person intervene? And what should the mechanism of intervention be? Vygotsky eventually came to this idea of the Zone of Proximal Development. And it essentially aims to map out the domain of knowledge or understanding of the learner into 3 categories. The things that you know or have mastered, the things that are within your comfort zone, the things that are relatively easy for you. And then outside of that is the much bigger domain of things that you don't know yet, the skills that you're yet to pick up, and that even with support or help you wouldn't be able to do, And you see, like those sort of areas obviously change over time, and the more you learn things, the bigger that area gets. And as you get older and you lose some of the skills that you had as a kid, that target is sort of always shifting. But the really interesting thing that Vygotsky eventually defined is this idea of a middle ground between the things that you know how to do and the things that you don't know how to do. And in that middle ground are the things that you can do with a little bit of help. They are currently just outside of your skill set, but like with a little bit of a push and a little bit of support, you'd be able to pick up that skill. And what he identified is that is the point of maximum benefit for a teacher's intervention. And it is also the point at which a student's focus or interest in learning is at its height. So very briefly, at least, that's kind of like what I would say the zone of proximal what the zone of proximal development defines and the questions that sort of led there. And like the zone of proximal development at different parts of our process, because if you think about the 6 tools we developed together in this program, it didn't necessarily have a single place, but it sort of showed its head up in different parts of the process. And I'd be interested to hear, like, do you have any aspect or point in either in developing the program or while we were working with the students where you kind of sort of saw this shining through or kind of like informed your thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been reflecting a lot on on like my own zone of proximal development and specifically like working through creation of communities and education and what it takes to both create authentic communities, but also like let people know that those things exist and like the role of marketing and communications in sort of like getting across any kind of intention. And I would say like as a writer, I love writing. Like that's definitely within my like acquired knowledge. Like it's something that not only do I think I'm fairly competent at, but it also I can do it really. Like getting started is easy for me. But for whatever reason, marketing writing is not easy for me. It's something that definitely feels hard and has always felt really hard. And I think like looking at it from the concept of the zone of proximal development helped me to understand that I actually had a lot of the pieces of what I needed to be able to write for social media specifically and marketing specifically. But I just wasn't executing those skills together under that intention. And being able to do so has really changed the way that I'm able to support myself and my family. So I feel like that was a pretty big change for me. And I think it's a good example because it also illustrates that sometimes like the thing that's holding us back isn't just like having the skills, it's also wanting to put the skills together in certain unique ways that you haven't before. Because all the things about writing for marketing I'd done before, like I've written emails, I've written tweets, I've written posts, but putting them all together into a campaign, like I've even, helped clients to work out content strategies for social media campaigns, but putting it all together for myself and doing it with the things that I'm working on as the product, that was the development for me. That was the like growth potential. Yeah. How about you? I feel like
Yeah.
you've grown so much, and I would love to hear one specific thing.
Yeah. I've had a lot, but I think one of the ones that's been the most surprising to me, and I don't know, your stories also has echoes of this, is when you find an area of growth that seems to be in a domain that you're really good at. So for me, it was like, I think for a lot of the people who already know me, they'll know that I'm very leaning on the extroverted side.
Hmm.
I love to spend time with people. I like to engage in conversation, specifically over and above simply like being around people. I really like to get into long and deep discussions. But I kind of eventually realized that there's sort of like a boundary to that passion or that interest. Like as soon as it goes from 1 or 2 people to like 3, 4, or 5, it's kind of like the passion, the interest, and more importantly, the ability seems to fall away. And I kind of
Mm.
realized like my ability to speak and engage with people sort of falls off as soon as I entered a group. And for a long time, I was just like, it's because there's something wrong with groups, or group discussions are not as authentic because people are hiding. But it's like all of those things are true, but also you're avoiding the issue.
I love that framing.
And so, like, I think I eventually realized that there's an aspect of group discussion, specifically facilitating group discussion outside the professional context. Because when I need to like have a client meeting or something like that, I feel like I'm in my zone. But then as soon as it gets to a personal like a personal context, you're in this group, especially when it's some people who come from some people who are from my own personal life, and then other people maybe who I work with, and then like different parts of my life come together. It's kind of like all the things I usually know how to do just fly out the window. And so for me, that
Hmm.
had been a big one. And so like, and I think, we'll talk about this either today or in one of our future podcasts, but it eventually led me to wanting to start a dinner club where we can engage in this type of discussion, because I think that was sort of like the iconic framing of the thing that I was avoiding.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say like that was at least for me one of the more memorable ones, and I think also because it's an aspect that I feel like I still need to grow into now. But I think it's also good because it kind of it takes you down a peg. It's easy to
Mm.
like, convince yourself that you're great at this specific aspect of your life and there's no room to grow. And then something just kind of like pops its head up and be like, not exactly. There's still a little bit of room to grow. And I think
Mhm.
this almost exemplifies one of the topics I think we're going to dive into, which is like, how do you actually know when you're getting into this thing called the zone of proximal development? Because I think, it fits nicely into three, circles. I think concentric circles might be the word.
Mhm.
It fits so nicely in the diagram, but it's like, obviously there's no diagram in real life. So like, I don't
Right.
know whether you've got any thoughts on this matter. Like, how do we know when we're getting there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the three ways that you're going to walk us through in this episode are really going to help other people. I hadn't thought about it too much, honestly, before we started talking about it. And I feel like now I see it all the time because I'm more aware of like those patterns. So yeah, I feel like should we get into
Mm,
it? Should we start with
I think we
the
should.
first
I
one?
think we
Okay.
should.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think yeah, we have let's see. Where do we want to start?
I think the first one we're going to look at is from Sarah. Yeah, from Sarah. And I think this is going to be cool because I actually think Sarah's example is somewhat similar to ours. Because,
Hmm.
this idea of kind of like being really good at something and finding your domain of specialization, and then having this tiny little niggly thing that sort of pops its head up. So with no
Yeah.
further ado, I'm gonna hop us into that video.
Sarah was one of our cohort one students, and Sarah Rice is a consultant. She has 2 decades of experience in information architecture consulting. And in this clip, I think she's going to be talking about her realization that she had a skill gap when it comes to marketing her services. So, very similar to my journey as well.
It's kind of hard to explain because it's like I'm still in the messy middle part of it, and so it's like I don't have the story all nice and neatly packaged and everything, which is fine. It's continually evolving. But like one of the things that I realize is that it's like I there were a lot of opportunities, and so whenever one opportunity was done, you know like I had a consulting gig and it was done, it's like, okay, here's the next one, and I would start the next one, and maybe there would be a lag in between, or a short lag or a longer lag or whatever. I could just kind of go from opportunity to opportunity. And this time around, I discovered a couple of things. One was, I think it makes sense to continue doing consulting. That was one of the big decisions that was made kind of in the middle of the in the middle of this course, as I did a lot of reflecting and talking to people and using all the tools that were presented and going through the course, and realizing it's like, oh, now it's time for me to do what every business does, which is go and market myself. Which, it's like, as I put it together, it's like, oh yes, like every company has a marketing team. That's a no-brainer. It's like, I'm a person of one, and so I need to go get my marketing team. And so that's where, like towards the end of the course, when I was talking about, yep, now I have to go get a marketing team, and then I dubbed it Team Sarah.
I love that clip. I just think that it's such a beautiful example because Sarah's so experienced in consulting and she's had such a successful
Mm.
career as a consultant. And it's still at this point in her career is this growth opportunity is in front of her. And it's almost like the universe is going to make you see it at some point, like she made it 2.5 decades of consulting project to consulting project to consulting project. And now, yeah, she's like, the universe has put her into this position where she has this real growth opportunity to really like move into this next phase. So yeah, I really like this
I
example.
think I think you're totally right. And if you think about the initial framing of the zone of proximal development with regards to what Sarah's outlining, she's talking about this domain of competence that she's established. She's been a consultant, worked on, some of the biggest tech companies in the world, consulting there. And then eventually coming to this realization that the domain of competence, the area where you're usually comfortable, seems to be getting uncomfortable, and in a way
Mhm.
that seems a little bit strange. And I think this is a great sign that you've got an opportunity to enter your zone of proximal development, because you already know that you've got a broad range of competence. It's like Sarah's been down the consulting route multiple times, and so there's this aspect of competence there. But at the same time, you first get the sense that it feels like your usual tricks are not working. And that is, in a sense, telling us that though we are close to our domain of competence, is an aspect of it that is either unfamiliar or an aspect of the context that has changed, that requires something from us which we don't yet possess. And I think that, in some sense, is what Sarah has sort of identified in herself. And I think what a lot of people are sort of realizing with all of the turmoil that's going on in the tech industry right now is like, you know, there is a lot of change, and like when you clean out the attic, you're gonna find some interesting
Mhm.
things there.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people are sort of coming into this realization of like, I've got these great set of skills, but there's something that I've maybe neglected a little bit for a while, and it's
Mm.
like it's now time to sort of address that.
No, I wanted to call out specifically how Sarah was very like clear that she knew the answer to the problem and that she's known the answer to the problem for a long time. Because I mean, because our examples are so similar, I can say that that is also true for me. Like it's not like I was unaware of marketing's role in a business, but it was almost like I never had to face it. And so it was never something that had the pressure on it that it needed to be a growth
Mm,
opportunity. And so I think there's something about like the shifting of the winds of, the
yeah.
field or the world or whatever that can change that balance. So
hmm
yeah.
And just before we move on to the second one, another aspect of this specific sign that's different to most other opportunities for learning, which actually trips a lot of people up. Because, when you think about a student or a child or somebody who is learning, but in a context that's socially seen as a student, it's acceptable
Mhm.
to admit insufficiency or inability and all of that. But when you've established for yourself this star-studded career and worked in all of these big brands, it's like it's difficult to say, but yes, but I still need to grow in this small
Yeah.
place. And that kind of the fear of being judged in in kind of admitting that can very often prevent you from learning that skill simply because you don't want to seem like you're still
Mm.
figuring out, because you've already
Yeah.
established yourself to be exceptional in some kind of way. And so in that
Yeah.
aspect, social pressure can definitely make that learning in that avenue a lot more challenging than in the others.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you brought that up because
Mm,
I think that that's very true for many folks, especially in design and tech jobs where things are just moving so fast that like it is very likely that you are doing something for the very first time, but it's also really common to go into a meeting where you're talking about that thing and you just, you're putting on the air of expertise to kind of give it that gravitas, but in the same way, you're cutting yourself off from the opportunity to have more of a collaborative growth opportunity by admitting that you are doing this for the first time. Like, I think that there's
mm,
a power in being able to say that you're doing something for the first time. And I think people can give you more grace. Like you're saying, it's almost
mm,
like children get that by default, but adults have to ask for it. I think that's a really
mm.
important point.
Yeah, yeah.
Great first
That's
sign. So to sum that up, then it's the sense of uncertainty about a skill that you usually are competent in.
and it'll almost feel like a little bit surprising. It's like I
Yeah, it's
should
like
be able to do
I
this. Like,
should
why
be
am I
I should be
struggling?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I think that's a
Yeah.
really good sign. Okay. All right, so let's get into our second sign. Alfie, can you walk us through the role of flow and how it is related to the zone of proximal development?
I think this one is almost on the other scale of what we were talking about in the first example, because the first example is an area of growth that's surrounded by a strong sense of competence. But for a lot of people, you might just be start entering an industry, or you might be like really at the beginning of figuring out what you want to do and not necessarily have a wealth of experience with which to look for an opportunity for growth. And so the second one is something that I think is more instinctual. And that's this idea of flow. So flow is completely separate from the zone of proximal development and isn't related to the work of Vygotsky. I think it was introduced by probably the psychologist with the hardest name to pronounce. It's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, if I'm not mistaken. I think
I
that
think you
might be
did that
it.
really well.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But so he was exploring also the area of growth and development, but from a different angle, and it's from the angle of like trying to get a sense of when people are most. It's sort of as a result of observing performance in different situations and contexts. And at the highest level, the flow state essentially defines a state of focus where a task is grabbing your focus so much that it seems like your sense of time sort of starts to shrink. You kind of get like this sort of tunnel vision sort of experience, and you become super engrossed in what you're doing. And now I think we experience this for many different reasons. And I think one of the analogies I like to use to explain flow in a tangible way is that you can think about flow as you can think about the measure of attention, like how attentive is a person at a specific point in time, and flow is when you're at your maximum peak. Now, this is important to the zone of proximal development for a couple of different reasons. When we think about the zone of proximal development, and we think about our first example, and how in the first example we have this person who is extremely competent and has found their sense of competence already, and they find that there's an area of growth that's sort of yet left unexplored. Now, this one is sort of on the other side, and it's more something that you can look out for, or from a phenomenological perspective, a sign you can look out for the zone of proximal development is when your focus is being drawn in this way. Because the reason we enter the flow state, is for two reasons. One, we can almost think about attention, or our attention as humans, or even in animals, as a proxy for the importance of something. So, a loud sound happens behind you, you turn and see what it is because it's pretty important that there's something that you can't see behind you. Or, a family member gives you a call in the middle of the night. It's like, that's very different from a family member giving you a call at 12, at midday. And so when we think about our attention being a proxy for importance, what the flow state is when all of our attention is being brought towards a subject that is important. Now, something being important can be so from an instinctual perspective for two reasons. Either it's valuable or it's dangerous. That's the only reason. Those are the only two reasons that our attention gets drawn to something. Now, assuming that we are in a safe place, because you can't enter the flow state when you perceive there to be danger, because you more enter fight or flight. But when you are in a state of safety, you feel comfortable and confident that you're in a space safe to explore. That sense of finding things that are of import is now reduced to only being attentive at things that we believe to be valuable. And so why this is relevant specifically to the zone of proximal development is when we get into a flow state, it one means that we're in a place that we think is safe to explore specifically. Two, it means that the thing that we're focusing on is important for some or other reason. Three, and so now there are a few different reasons that it can be important. One, it might be because it brings pleasure or joy or something of that kind, which is positive in its own right. But the other reason for that is because there's something useful for us to learn there. And we see this when we're playing games. We see this when we're engaging in conversation. It's like when your focus and your attention are sort of like zooming in, it's because we're like, oh, there's something valuable, like focus in. But then at the same time, if, for example, there's a loud sound, you'll immediately be broken out of that. And it's kind of this thing of like, it's sort of like a sense inside of yourself telling you like, am I really focused? It's probably because there's something important there. And so this
Yeah.
is a sign of where we can find things that we at an instinctual level know to be valuable, which at a logical level we might not yet. And because you're entering, like, if we bring it back to the beginning of this, distinguishing between the really experienced person and the person who has got no experience, the person who doesn't have experience needs to find signs for areas to explore because you need something to direct you to see where you want to learn. And so
Hmm.
looking for activities that put you into the flow state is a fantastic starting point for that.
That's so brilliant. Also, the role of safety is so important there too, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later when we talk about more knowledgeable other. But yeah, I feel like that's something I hadn't really thought too much about of like this
Mm,
dichotomy between your sense of safety and your ability to get into the flow state. I think there's something really
mhm.
important there for yeah, to say about like workplace dynamics and
And
mentorship
performance.
and
Yeah.
peership performance. I mean, it just applies to so many things related to how we make sense of ourselves, how we work with others. Like, yeah, so
Mm,
important. Mm.
100%. And we've got another example I'd like us to just watch and then talk through because I think it'll give us that level of understanding of why the flow state
Mhm.
is important because I think it even might go beyond some of the aspects which I talked to. So our next participant was one of the people who so graciously volunteered to be a guinea pig before the program was done. So not obviously to
Mhm.
prepare for our first cohort of students, we wanted to try this out and make sure we weren't bringing something in that hadn't stood the test of reality. And so Dylan is one of the designers that I've coached in the past, and so he volunteered to share a little bit in preparation for our first cohort. So, with no
Thank you,
further
Dylan.
ado, thank you, Dylan.
So my oldest brother approached me that he wants to start a car detailing business. And he's based in New Zealand, and I essentially had to take from branding all the way to the development of the website design, all of those things, writing
Mm,
content. Um, and this is the project that I've probably put that took me into the flow state the most of any project I've been in or I've done.
mm,
Like I was like, I had to do it over the weekends, and I would literally get sucked up that whole weekend, and
mm,
I would enjoy it so much. It's crazy. Like I was so passionate about it. Because there was no brief, there was no guidelines. It was completely just from scratch, me coming up with a concept. Why is this like completely? There was no guidance at all. So it took so
mm,
much time, but it was so fun. So yeah, then I went through that whole process. I think the first thing that was definitely different is I had to learn something new that I haven't done before. So I've never had to, from doing website development, I've never had to do e-commerce. So actually have a cart button, all the payment systems, and being able to add things to a cart and just pay and structure the website around that sort of features. So that was one of the reasons I would say that got me super invested or got me into the flow state is something new that I was doing. And the visual style of the project or of this project was I could go as crazy as I would want to. So there was
mm,
no limitations. There was no like client expectations or specific client requirements that they would want for the specific
mm.
project. It was just me and this project, and
Yeah.
I could do literally everything I wanted and what I love and brands that I resonate with. I could go in that direction. So I would say those the things. There were feelings involved, were frustration, definitely one of the biggest ones, is because it was also a self-learning process, though there was a lot of hiccups and hurdles that I needed to get through. So it wasn't, I went into the project not knowing that I'd be able to do it. So I wasn't sure if I'm even capable of doing it, but I still went for it. And I think that's, whereas with almost every other project, I know I can do it because I design it in such a way that I know it's definitely possible. Thinking of Webflow as the tool that I'm using to build the website, I know, okay, I can do this. With this one, it wasn't that.
Yeah.
I love this clip. Such a good example. Yeah. Oh, Dylan.
It feels like it was over scripted.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I feel like back to the point that we were talking about regarding safety, like if I had to project a little bit into Dylan's comments about why he felt so free on this assignment for his brother, it seems like it's a matter of safety. Like he had the unconditional love aspect of doing this work for his family, that he could go big. Like he could test that relationship more than a client relationship might be able to be tested. So
Yes.
I do think that there is an element of safety that is a part of why he was able to lose weekends and feel good about it. Like, I mean, I've lost weekends to client work. I don't think I've ever felt good about it, but I think I mean, I helped my little sister to design and build her own booth for a farmer's market 2 years ago, because she's a pastry chef and a baker on the weekends. And I had a similar experience. Like when I was working for her, I got to do all sorts of like print design things that I haven't done in years. And I messed up a bunch of times. Like there was stuff that I'm not so good at because I haven't practiced for all these years. But it always felt like it was something I was able to feel good about, like investing time into. And yeah, the flow state was easier to get into than if I was like, you know, doing a branding project for like a client. I think that would be very, very stressful for me.
Yeah. I think you're totally right. And like you put the nail on the head. It's like when in a sense, it's because the thing is, the end goal isn't safety. Like that's not the end goal. The end goal is it being safe enough that you can enter risky territory.
You can be in the flow. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like you need to have a sense of safety that you can go back to if you go out too far. And that's kind of like what we're in some sense aiming for. And I know we don't have time to play the whole clip, but as you were speaking, I was actually remembering the full conversation. One of the things he said that made him feel confident and comfortable in that level of safety is he knew that if shit hits the fan, he's got a team of designers that he works with at work that he feels comfortable going to speak to and getting advice from, which he shared with me that he did end up doing. So you're 100% right. It's like you need to have that initial safety so that you can feel comfortable enough to take a risk, because learning is a risk.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so we have 2 of the 3 signs outlined so far. Number 1, you feel like you have some useful skills, but also something's not working. Like you need to acquire something else. And then number 2, you can get into the flow. So don't leave us hanging, Alfie. What is our 3rd sign that you might be in your zone of proximal development?
Yeah. This one was, of the 3, this one was the hardest for me to put into words, because it feels like it's even more instinctual than the other 2. I think the flow state, in some sense, is instinctual, but it's easy, especially retrospectively, to know when you've been in the flow state. It's like, oh, like, it's kind of like, your head just comes above water and you're like, damn, where am I? And so you might say from a phenomenological perspective, that one is pretty easy to see. I think that the third and final one, which I'm hoping to talk about, which is maybe a little bit convoluted, but it's more like you get this sense of curiosity or desire to try out new things. And it's, in some ways, it's I distinguish it from the level of flow in how it actually gets embodied. And the way that it gets embodied is either in looking up to someone. So like a person who illustrates something that you admire, or it might be something that seems to have more meaning than it ought. It's sort of like, someone may give you a piece of advice and maybe it's something you've heard 100 times, but at that moment it just hits you.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because the reason that it hit you this time is because in some sense you're more open to it. And the reason that you're more open to it is because you are in this state where you need a solution. Yeah, and so I think that the example we're going to get into is a fantastic example of this, because it's sort of like it's got this strange, tennis situation where it's sort of like one person helping the other and sort of switching roles. But I think beyond, like, looking a level deeper than that, the important thing is how something you say to help somebody else at a different context and a different time, it can be advice that you need to hear, even though it came from you. It's like the thing you need to help yourself came from you. So, if you're cynical, you might ask yourself, well, if it came from you, why didn't you just tell yourself that from to begin with? And I think this example will kind of do a great job of kind of like illustrating that. So I don't know if you want to maybe introduce these next two students of ours.
Yeah. So in this next example, we're going to be talking to two students. And I think that this is a really beautiful example of peers just like switching off who is versus who needs the more knowledgeable other. I think it's like in the very beginning, the first clip we're going to watch, Mary is explaining the confidence trick that a peer gave to her. So we'll start there and then we'll pick it up and look at the second.
I think so Sarah and I would meet quite regularly for sort of body doubling. And sometimes we would just sort of say, hi, what are you working on? What are you working on? Okay. And then I'd set a timer. But other times, you could tell one of us had something to share, explain what it was. Well, how will I know if this is the right thing? Because it doesn't feel right. And maybe I shouldn't have done that. And I'm just sort of stuck in this loop. And she said, okay. So let's take a breath together. So we would often do that, just sort of pause and take a breath. And she said, I'm going to give you a coat and I want you to put it on. And that's your confidence coat. And when that's on, every decision you've made is the right one. You're going to own it and you're going to take the next step. And whatever that next step is, that's the right one because you're doing all the things that you should be doing. So, try that out. I said, okay, I will. And then I kind of joked the next day. I said, I woke up and I was feeling a little, uncertain. And then I found that coat and I put it on again. And, and it's really, really helpful. But, I don't know, I'm a scientist. Like there's no real coat, right? But it just this idea of, okay, this is giving me permission or shielding me from the doubt, or I don't know what it is. But it's very helpful.
Oh my gosh. I'm a scientist. I mean, there's not a real coat. It's like the best line ever. No, but though, like the stories that we tell ourselves are so strong, and like we can tell ourselves those strong stories for very specific reasons to get ourselves out of things like fear, lack of confidence. I think that that's a beautiful one. Okay, like let's go to the next clip. So in the second clip, Sarah will be speaking, and in this case, Mary is going to give that same advice back to Sarah, who started this whole confidence coaching to begin with. So why don't we watch the clip from Sarah?
I was meeting with someone who was beating themselves up, and I was like, please stop doing that. please stop doing that. You're hurting my friend. Please cut that out. Like there's a sense of like, oh, I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't do that, or whatever. And I'm like, no, we're taking all bad thoughts out, and we're we're trying on good things. And so just the idea of, and really it came from her. I asked a question. I just asked a question of like, what would be the most helpful, or something to help her reflect. And she's like, I could just try it on. I'm like, oh, like a coat? Could you try it on like a coat? And she's like, oh. And for some reason that she grabbed onto that, and just, it was so super helpful. And so, and so she talks about her coat. And the funny thing is like, I was meeting with her the other day and I was having a hard time, and she's like, this really wise person told me about this coat that you could wear. And I was like, I died laughing. I'm like, isn't it so interesting when our words come back to us?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
It was
confidence
so
quote
fun
for
to
me is
find those
iconic.
two. Like when we found those two examples, both in their interviews, we were like, oh my gosh, this is so. Because the way that Sarah talks about the moment of the confidence coat coming out is so different than the way that Mary describes it. And I don't think either one of them is like the court recorded version of what happened. But like in Sarah's version, she's sort of just like, oh, like a coat, like kind of asking questions. But in Mary's version, it's basically like Sarah's like, here is a coat, put it on. Like this will work. And it's very like Sarah has this confidence in Mary's story versus in Sarah's version of it, Sarah's just mirroring Mary. Like Mary is the one that created the confidence coat, but Mary truly believes that Sarah like
Yeah.
sewed it and delivered it, went back for the fitting, like the whole thing, and then she's like, I'm a scientist, there's not even a coat. So yeah, it's such a great example.
100%. And it comes to this question about the more knowledgeable other, because I realized I didn't outline it just yet. But so, with the context of the zone of proximal development, you have those three areas: the things you know how to do, the things that are completely out of your abilities, and the middle ground that you can grow in. And so the final aspect that Vygotsky added to his body of work is the idea of the more knowledgeable other, the person who helps you through that middle ground, right? Now, in Vygotsky's work, he originally did work with children. And so, you might scratch your head and ask yourself, like, does this work for me as an adult? But I think what this example illustrates is that even our sense of competence shifts with the context that we're in. It's like you can feel super competent when you're in a small group having a discussion, and then feel out of your depth when you're in a larger group, like a dinner party.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like changing context can shift where you're knowledgeable and where you're capable. And so what's so amazing about this idea of peer mentorship, which we introduced in the first episode, is that you're bringing two people to the table who understand that they are both the student and the mentor. They're both the support and the person who needs support. And I think Sarah and Mary do a perfect job of sort of illustrating that.
Totally agree. Okay, so should we restate the three signs? I feel like that might be useful for folks. Do you want to take a shot at that, or you want me to?
I'd be happy to do that.
Okay.
So, and I think maybe I'll just first touch on why it's important to know these three signs, because the zone of proximal development, as I said, makes sense as a diagram, makes sense as a theory and all that, but it's a little bit harder to know what that is in real life. And so what, Abby and I were hoping to get out of this is like things that you could look out for in your own life that might be signs of something important to learn or an area of growth that might be valuable to you. And so the first one is when you get that sense that a skill that you have, one of the tricks in your arsenal, isn't quite working right, and there's a bit of a skill gap in a domain where you typically feel competent. This shows you that you're working from a domain of competence, the area of no knowledge, but there is a space that's still a gap, that's the domain of the unexplored. And that's the one thing to look at. But sometimes you're not entering a domain where you're already an expert. You need to go kind of look for an area of growth in a domain that's completely unfamiliar to you. And so what you can do is look back on your own experiences, either in activities that are similar to this, or simply looking through your day and finding activities where your focus where you've gotten hyper focused and where you've entered the flow state, because those can very often, not always, but often be indicators that there's something valuable to be learned, which you find intrinsically motivating. And I think that part is specifically important because you only enter flow when you think it's important. And finally, a desire for experimentation or trying new things. And this is specifically important because it's not necessarily 100% the same as curiosity. Because I think curiosity both includes wanting to try out new things as well as simply wanting to know, like a question that you're curious about, which is no real outcome. But I think specifically curiosity that drives experimentation is the final and third important aspect, because it'll usually guide us to either something that we admire or some aspect which we can grow in. And so those are the three main things you can look for if you are looking for an area to grow in. And
Awesome.
yeah.
So I already know, I can hear them already saying it. They're like, okay, I want to get into the zone of proximal development thing. What's the first step I should take?
To find your own zone of proximal development? I think there are two ways that you can go about it. One, which I think we sort of did in the program, which is speaking to the people who know you. I think too often, because people know us, we sort of tell ourselves we already have heard everything that they have to say about us, and we kind of know what they're going to say and like convince ourselves of that. So I think the first thing would be to ask the people around you who know you about both of the things that things that you might be good at, or the things that they think you would be interested in, simply to give you, information. But I think the other thing that you can also do, which relates to the sort of second sign, is to just kind of go through your day, and based on your day, give yourself a sense of what are the times that you've entered the flow state. And you can literally go through your calendar. It's like, were there specific meetings? Was there a lunch with a friend? Was it when you were baking cake for your, the aunt who you haven't seen for a very long time? But just making a list of those days, kind of like when you're trying to make a schedule, but instead of now looking at how much time each of the activities take, look at, in some sense, how much time you lost because of focus. Yeah. And so I think those are two sort of good places that you can start with looking for aspects that you can grow in.
Okay. And how about involving peers in the zone of proximal development? Like, I feel like the whole concept of milestones that we gave to our students to work with each other, I think that might be interesting to talk through.
Yeah. And thanks for reminding me of that, because I think that one more builds on top of the in the context of the zone of proximal development, understanding the more knowledgeable other. Because another idea which eventually came from Vygotsky's work, but I don't think he necessarily was the one who coined it, is this idea of scaffolding. And it's a technique used in teaching where you're almost giving the person the raw materials they need for the skill. So, for example, if you're teaching somebody how to ride a bike, you might hold the bike with them and push them so that they can figure out what the balance is. And you can think about it like scaffolding, like similar to construction, how you put scaffolding around a building while you're doing the initial frame. The idea of scaffolding when it comes to teaching is to provide support in getting initial familiarity when a person is stepping outside of their comfort zone. And so in the context now of peers, and specifically peer mentorship, one of the great things that we can do, especially when we've built a level of trust with another person, is to speak our intentions out into the world, but specifically in the context of action. So if, for example, me as a person who wanted to get better at group discussions, I may have this great vision in my mind of, hosting a great party with presidents and CEOs and great people and all of that, but it's obviously not going to start there. Because we understand the value of the zone of proximal development, we need to choose something that pushes us out of our comfort zone, but something that is also outside of our comfort zone. And so what we can do is to, based on the goals that we have, the things that we want to achieve, set milestones and share them with a peer. Now, this is value in multiple ways. On the one hand, you externalize your goal and now have somebody to help hold you accountable. So that's the first aspect of value. You've got an accountability partner. The second aspect of value is your more knowledgeable other now also has got a measure for when you're too far out of your comfort zone and when you're not pushing yourself hard enough. Because as a mentor, as a teacher, you can't always see that. With a child or with a baby, it's pretty obvious when they're learning a new skill because it's clear the things that they need to learn. But as we get to adults and as the skills and things that we're learning become so diverse, there's a level of self-reporting that's required. And so getting into this idea of having a back and forth and being able to talk about a short achievable milestone and then be able to engage with someone and have them either help you achieve it or to lower your expectations if you're aiming too far has got a massively important effect, because it kind of creates for us a growth cycle, a loop of constant improvement. And that really is how we can turn the zone of proximal development into a tool for leveraging lifelong learning.
Yeah. I have one from our work together that I'd love to share, which is I was going to talk about writing, which feels like very professional and lofty. And I have set milestones around writing in our time working together, but I actually wanted to talk about my tiny garden house instead because I feel like that's more it's more milestone-y. So I don't know, probably about a year ago, Alfie and I started to dive into the work of understanding ourselves. And it was very clear that I didn't have much when it came to non-work stuff. Like all of my non-work stuff was mom stuff. It was like I was either mom stuff or work stuff. And I'm a really creative person. I like using my hands. I like doing things. I have not a lot of spare time, but I do have some. And I have a tendency to pour that spare time into the work stuff or the mom stuff when something doesn't exist in between. And so as a little milestone, I was like, I'm gonna find a meaningless hobby. And so I have found a hobby which involves like putting together miniature kits. And the one that I'm working on for the last few months is a tiny garden house. I don't get much done on it every week. It happens in like 10 or 15-minute increments, but just the idea of shifting that model a little bit for myself by introducing this new other thing, yeah, it made a lot of difference in terms of how I thought about myself and kind of the direction that I'm going in. So yeah, do you have like a milestone short story from our time together?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I'm like, well, I think it's a good example, and I've already teed it up a couple of times. But for me, I had this objective of kind of becoming better at group discussions, specifically in the personal environment. And so one of the ones that I did, which ended up very interesting, is I decided I would sort of try to make this kind of group personal type discussion or non-professional type discussion a part of my life on an ongoing basis. So I decided I would host a dinner party, a dinner club. And it definitely pushed me outside my comfort zone. I can say that for certain. But, interestingly enough, it was like the biggest learning was in learning that you can unknowingly push other people out of their comfort zone. Because I think obviously a group discussion is a thing that has got many different people. And group dynamics are very different to require something very different to manage than one-on-one engagement. And it also, I think, was a great experience for me because it also it reminded me that I've got room to grow in that domain. Because I had gotten, and rightly so, confident about it. And I think that confidence can sometimes blind you. And so kind of just reminding yourself that you've got room to grow is a good thing for the ego.
It reminds me how anytime you throw a dinner party, there's always leftover dessert the next day. And it's like Alfie had a big old slice of humble pie the day after his dinner party.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I remember that very well.
And I think, one of the things I'm hoping we can do in some of our next discussions is tying this dinner party with some of the work our students were doing, because, you set this amazing milestone. It's it's so aligned with your values. You go out, you try it, and you hit a brick wall, and you go home with your tail between your legs. What now?
Yes.
How does this more knowledgeable other and this zone of proximal development help you get through that? And I hope that is going to be the center of our subject next time.
I think so. Yeah. I think our next episode is hopefully going to be about your collaborative problem solving framework with peership at the center. And yeah, I'm jazzed about that. I think it's going to be really useful for folks. So, all right, let's close this thing down. Second episode, we're putting it in the books. Let's ask the question I am sure is on every listener's mind. How made sense of are we at this moment? Alfie, would you like to start?
I have to say, I'm more made sense of than the last time we asked ourselves this question. I think I've had a couple of existential questions pass across my desk and being shipped off, which is good. But I'd say at a general stage, the sense-making aspect I'm exploring at this point in time in some ways, I think is related to values, but specifically in how I allocate my time, like how I think about where I'm spending my time professionally versus personally, and socially. I think that's where my focus is right now. And yourself, Abby, how made sense of are you right now?
Whew. I feel like more and more every day. I feel, yeah, more made sense of every day. I'm not going to kid myself that's not going to go backwards at some point, but for now, I feel like things are in a really positive direction. I feel like the zone of proximal development could not be a better theme for this month for me, because I feel like with the Sensemakers Club, I'm doing some work expanding it with discussion groups on the horizon, and yeah, I feel like everything about that project is putting me outside of my comfort zone, but it's all using skills that I've acquired along the way, and I do feel a sense of safety from just the like absolutely radically kind support that I've gotten from the 40 people that I've brought on as discussion leaders to start their training for opening this thing up in a couple months, to just the folks that are reaching out to me personally to say how excited they are for this thing coming. So yeah, I feel like everything is it's coming up roses. It's yeah, it feels really good. In terms
That's
of this
pretty.
podcast too, I feel like we've now successfully recorded 2 episodes of a podcast. So that's a big deal. I also feel like when you do your second episode of the podcast, you're supposed to say things like, if you liked this podcast, think about sending it to a friend, maybe hit review or subscribe. That would mean a lot to us. I know we've only recorded 2 episodes, but if you're getting something out of this, we would love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn. You can reach out to us on email. You can send a carrier pigeon, one to South Africa, one to Florida, see which one gets there first. Yeah, we want to hear from you. So let us know what you're hearing, what you want to hear from us. And yeah, anything to close, Alfie?
Wherever you're hearing this, let us know what you're trying to learn this month.
Yeah.
I'm going to close on that.
Okay. Okay. As always, sense makers, be clear.